Have you ever stopped to think about the weight a simple gesture carries? That kind of automatic kindness, born before thought, before logic, before fear. The kind of thing you do because you still believe that being human means extending a hand, even when all the scars on your chest scream not to. She knew she should have ignored it. She knew that opening that door in the middle of the night for a wounded stranger shrouded in secrets was a risk she couldn't afford to take. But when you've lost so much, when you've lived long enough to understand that life doesn't reward the cautious, sometimes kindness becomes the only piece of you that still feels real. It was 3 a.m. when she first saw him. The restaurant had been closed for hours, and she had only returned because she had forgotten to lock the cash register. The street was empty, too silent for a city that never truly slept. And then, there on the front steps, was a man, sitting, motionless, his body bent in a way she instantly recognized, not because she had seen it before, but because it had been like that once. The posture of someone who is hurt but cannot show weakness. The posture of someone who knows that asking for help might be more dangerous than bleeding in silence. She should have gone back to the car. She should have called someone. She should have done anything but what she did. But there was dried blood on the collar of his dark old shirt, and he held his left arm with his right hand in a way that seemed unconscious, as if his body had learned on its own to hide the pain. She knew that gesture. She knew it too well, and perhaps that's what made her stop. Not compassion, but memory. The visceral recollection of what it's like to be broken and invisible at the same time. She unlocked the door slowly, each click of the key sounding too loud in the empty early morning. She didn't open it completely, just enough to push a plate through the crack, leftover food from dinner, still warm. Because she always prepared something in advance, an old habit from when she didn't live alone. Her words came out quickly, almost harsh, as if the brusqueness could protect them both from that dangerously human moment. Eat, then leave. It wasn't an invitation. It was an order disguised as kindness. The kind of thing you say when you want to help without getting involved. When you want to do the right thing without paying the price that doing the right thing always demands. He raised his eyes, and it was in that second, in that tiny fragment of time, that everything changed without her realizing it. Because those eyes weren't the eyes of someone defeated. They were tired, yes, heavy with something she couldn't name, but they were also attentive, calculating. The kind of gaze that scans the room before blinking, that registers exits, that measures distances. The kind of gaze that doesn't suit a man sitting on dirty steps in the middle of the night, bleeding and alone. And then he spoke. His voice was low, hoarse, but firm. You shouldn't have done that. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't anger. It was a warning. The kind of phrase that carries more truth than you're prepared to hear. And she felt, in that instant, that familiar chill running down her spine. That sensation that she had just crossed an invisible line, that she had placed herself on a map where she didn't want to be. But it was too late. The door was open. The plate was in his hand, and something small and silent had already begun to move in the shadows around them. Perhaps you've felt this before. That moment when you realize you've made a choice and can't go back, even if you don't yet know exactly what you chose. She stood there for another 3 seconds, enough time to see him pick up the plate with his uninjured hand, enough time to realize he didn't look away, as if he were memorizing her face, keeping every detail for a purpose she couldn't imagine. And then she closed the door, locked it, and leaned against the other side, listening to her own heart beating too fast, feeling that she had just done something irrevocable. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know where he came from, why he was hurt, or what those words really meant. But something inside her, instinctive and ancient, was already whispering an inconvenient truth. That man was not what he seemed. And her kindness, that simple, human gesture of offering food to an injured stranger, had just placed her in a kind of danger she wasn't even beginning to understand. She stayed awake the rest of the night, not because she wanted to, but because her body simply wouldn't rest. She sat in the empty restaurant kitchen, lights off, staring at the front door as if he could return at any moment, or as if something else could. The silence weighed more heavily than it should, and every distant sound from the street, a passing car, the wind pushing trash across the sidewalk, made her jump. She tried to convince herself she was exaggerating, that it had just been an injured man, a strange moment, nothing more. But his voice kept echoing. "You shouldn't have done that," as if he knew something she didn't, as if he had seen something coming that she couldn't yet see. When the sun finally began to brighten the horizon, she got up, her body aching and her mind still racing. She opened the restaurant at her usual time, made the coffee, cleaned the tables, did everything she always did. But it was different. Movements were automatic, mechanical, while her mind remained stuck in that early morning. She found herself looking at the entrance steps more times than she cared to admit, searching for signs that he had actually been there. There was nothing, no trace of blood, no forgotten plates. It was as if he had never existed. And perhaps it would have been easier to believe that. Perhaps it would have been safer to pretend she had imagined it all, that tiredness and loneliness had conspired to create a ghost in the early morning. But then, when she went to clean the counter, she saw it, a crumpled napkin left in the corner where no one sat. She picked it up with slightly trembling hands, unfolded the paper carefully, and felt the air leave her lungs when she read the words scribbled there, written hastily, but with clear intent. "Don't go out alone after 10. Don't trust the man at the gas station." If you've ever felt that kind of fear that starts slowly, almost imperceptibly, and then grows until it occupies every space inside you, then you know what she felt at that moment. Because those words didn't make sense. They shouldn't. Marcus, the man at the gas station 3 blocks away, was a long-time customer. Polite, always paid on time, always smiled, always asked how she was. He had never given her reason to distrust him. And yet, there was a wounded stranger, someone she had seen for less than a minute, warning her about him. How did he know? Why did he know? She crumpled the napkin tightly, her fingers pressing the paper into a small, tight ball. Her first instinct was to throw it away, forget it, move on. But she couldn't. Something about those words, something about the urgency with which they had been written, prevented her from dismissing it as madness. And then, when she looked up and glanced out the restaurant window, she saw Marcus, standing across the street, alone, looking directly at her. It wasn't the first time he'd passed by, but it was the first time she'd truly paid attention. The way he didn't look away. The way he stood there, motionless, unhurried, as if waiting for her to realize he was watching. And when she finally looked away, her heart pounding, he didn't move. He just stayed there, motionless, present, like a silent reminder of something she didn't yet understand. If something in this story is affecting you, if you've ever felt what it's like to realize that danger was closer than you imagined, leave a comment below about what has impacted you the most so far. Here at Heart of Protection Stories, we believe these emotions matter, and every word you share is part of this journey with us. She closed the restaurant early that day. She told herself she was tired, that she needed to rest, but the truth was, she couldn't pretend to be normal anymore. She locked everything twice, checked the windows, pulled the curtains, and when she finally sat down on the sofa in the small back room, where she had lived alone since her husband had left and never returned, she held that crumpled napkin in her hands and let the question she had been avoiding finally take shape. Who was that man? And why did he know things that nobody should know? But what she still didn't understand, what she still couldn't imagine, was that the warning wasn't just about Marcus. It was about everything. About the entire city. About the fact that she, unknowingly, had just become visible to people who preferred not to be seen. And now, whether she wanted to or not, she was at the center of something much bigger than a gesture of kindness in the early morning. Something that was already in motion. Something that no one, not even she, could stop alone. This is where the story begins to show what's really at stake. She wasn't naive. That needs to be clear. Because there's a huge difference between kindness and innocence, and she had learned that lesson the hard way. 3 years ago, she still believed that people told the truth, that those you love protect you from secrets that can destroy everything. 3 years ago, she was married, had plans, dreamed of a life bigger than that small restaurant in a town no one chose to visit, only passed through by chance. And then her husband disappeared. He didn't die in an accident. He didn't get sick. He simply vanished. And 2 weeks later, men she had never seen knocked on the door demanding payment of a debt she didn't know existed. A gambling debt. A debt to people who don't accept excuses or promises. She sold everything of value she owned to pay it off, keeping only the restaurant because no one wanted to buy it. And since then, she lived alone, with her door locked and her heart smaller, more cautious, more closed. But that morning, something in her gave way. Perhaps it was the weariness of pretending to be tough all the time, of building walls so high that she couldn't even breathe properly anymore. Perhaps it was the visceral memory of when she had needed help, and no one offered a hand, when the neighbors looked away and friends stopped answering the phone. Perhaps it was just humanity, that kind of automatic kindness that some people carry like a curse, even after being trampled on by it repeatedly. She didn't expect gratitude from that man. She didn't expect recognition. She didn't expect him to come back, or for it to mean anything. She just wanted him to eat, to recover minimally, and to disappear before someone saw him there and started asking questions she wouldn't know the answers to. But now, sitting in that small, silent room, with the crumpled napkin still in her hands, she realized the magnitude of her mistake, because helping someone in that city wasn't a neutral act. It was a statement. It was taking a stand. And she, who had spent 3 whole years trying to become invisible, trying not to draw attention, trying only to survive without bothering anyone, had just placed herself at the center of something she didn't understand. The warning about Marcus kept hammering in her head. How did that stranger know? What had he seen? And more importantly, what had Marcus done to deserve a warning like that? She began mentally reviewing all the interactions she'd had with Marcus in the last few months. He was always polite, punctual, and nice. He came to the restaurant at least 3 times a week, always late at night, always alone. I ordered the same thing, black coffee and apple pie. He would sit in the corner, fiddling with his phone, sometimes making quick calls in a low voice. She had never really paid attention before, because he was just another customer, another familiar face in a routine of repeating faces. But now, reviewing everything with this new perspective, she was beginning to notice details that had gone unnoticed. The way he always arrived after 10, when the place was already quiet and she was almost alone. The way he sat with his back to the wall, always facing the door. The way he looked around before entering, as if checking if anyone was following him. The impact of that revelation hit her slowly, like a cold wave coursing through her bones. Marcus wasn't an ordinary client. He never had been. And somehow, that wounded stranger knew it. Which meant he wasn't just a man passing through town. He knew things. He saw things. And he had chosen to warn her, even at the risk of exposing himself. Why? What did she represent in this whole equation? She had no power, no money, no valuable information. She was just a woman trying to survive in a forgotten place, or at least that's what she thought. The hidden truth was beginning to take shape in the shadows of what she couldn't yet name. A journey was unfolding around her, a silent transformation of the reality she thought she knew. And that simple gesture of offering food to a stranger had been the gateway to something much bigger. She felt it in her bones, in the way fear had changed in quality. It was no longer the abstract fear of loneliness or bankruptcy. It was the concrete fear of someone who realizes they are being watched, who understands that decisions have already been made by others, decisions that involve her without her being consulted. She spent the next 2 days in a constant state of alert. She opened the restaurant, served the customers, but her eyes were always searching, always checking. Marcus showed up Wednesday night, as usual. He sat in his usual place. He ordered his usual But this time, when he looked at her, she looked back, and she saw the way he measured her every move, how he registered who came in and who went out, how his eyes lingered for a second longer on the back door. And when he paid the bill and left, she locked the door immediately behind him, even though there was still half an hour left before closing time. Comment below. This makes sense to me. From that moment on, everything begins to change silently. It was on Friday that things started to escalate in a way she could no longer ignore. She arrived at the restaurant early in the morning, as she always did, and immediately noticed something was wrong. The car's rear tire was flat, not deflating gradually, like when you hit a nail on the road. Completely flat, as if someone had deliberately opened the valve. She stood there for a few seconds, staring at the tire, feeling that chill running down her spine. It could be a coincidence. It could be bad luck. It could be anything. But it wasn't. She knew. It wasn't. The next day, the lamp at the restaurant entrance was broken. Not burned out, broken. Shards of glass scattered across the floor, as if someone had thrown a stone or hit it on purpose. She cleaned everything silently, changed the bulb, but her hands trembled as she did so. They were small things. Things that could be explained in other ways. Things that, if she told anyone, would seem like paranoia, the exaggeration of a lonely woman living in too much fear. But she knew the difference between chance and a message. And these were messages. Someone was saying, without words, that they saw her, that they knew where she was, that they could get close whenever they wanted. The change in the behavior of those around her was subtle, but impossible to ignore. On Tuesday, Donna Celia, a longtime customer who always stopped to chat, entered the restaurant, placed her order in silence, and left without looking her in the eye. On Wednesday, two men she had never seen before entered, sat down, ordered only coffee, and stayed there for almost 2 hours without eating anything, just observing. She felt the weight of those gazes as if they were hands tightening around her neck. And on Thursday, it was Donna Vera who pulled her aside after paying the bill and whispered softly, almost embarrassed, "Be careful who you help, dear. Some people think you're involved in something wrong." Involved? The word kept echoing in her head long after Donna Vera had left. Involved in what? She had done nothing more than offer food to a wounded man. He hadn't stolen, hadn't lied, hadn't conspired with anyone. He had simply been human on a cold night. And now she was being treated as if she had committed a crime. As if kindness were a betrayal. As if extending a hand were the same as choosing a side in a war she didn't even know existed. The impact of this revelation fell upon her with overwhelming weight. She wasn't just scared. She was alone in a way she had never felt before. Because the fear that came from the shadows she could face, but the fear that came from the neighbors, the clients, the people she thought knew her, that was different. That was the kind of fear that gnaws from within, that makes you question every interaction, every look, every silence. She began to wonder how many of those people truly cared about her, and how many were just waiting to see what would happen, like spectators watching an accident in slow motion. The decisions she needed to make began to pile up like unpaid debts. Should she close the restaurant for a few days? Should she call the police? And what exactly should she say? That a stranger had left a note warning about a customer, and now strange things were happening. That she was being watched, but had no proof, just a feeling that wouldn't leave her chest. She knew how that kind of story sounded. He knew that women alone who complained about things they couldn't prove were treated as hysterical, dramatic. So she did the only thing she thought she could do. She carried on. She opened the restaurant every day, served coffee, cleaned tables. He feigned normalcy so strongly that sometimes he even believed everything was fine. But the hidden truth continued to grow, taking shape behind the scenes of her life, on a journey she hadn't chosen, but from which she could no longer escape. And it was on one of those nights, when she was closing alone, that she saw Marcus again. He didn't come in. He just stood on the other side of the street, as he had done before. But this time, he wasn't alone. There was another man with him, taller, broader, and the two of them were looking directly at the restaurant door, talking quietly, like people planning something they don't want anyone to hear. Her legs felt weak. She locked the door with trembling hands, turned off the lights, and leaned against the wall, trying to control her breathing. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears, too loud, too fast. And then, in that suffocating silence, she heard a knock on the back door. 3 knocks. Firm. Controlled. She froze. No one used the back door. No one knew it existed, except for suppliers and herself. The knocks repeated, and then a voice. Low, familiar. It's me. Open up. It was him, the stranger from the early morning. What seems simple begins to reveal layers that no one expected. She stood paralyzed for a full 3 seconds, her body pressed against the wall, her breath caught in her chest. His voice was unmistakable, that low, controlled tone she'd heard only once, but which had been etched into her memory like a permanent mark. It's me. Open up, as if it were simple, as if she had any reason to trust him, as if opening that door wasn't possibly the worst decision she could make. But there was something in his voice, something that wasn't a threat, but urgency. And when she looked through the crack in the front door curtain and saw Marcus and the other man still there, standing, watching, she realized she didn't have many options. She crossed the empty restaurant in the darkness, each step seeming too loud in the silence. She unlocked the back door slowly, and he entered before she could change her mind, closing the door immediately behind him. He was different, cleaner, no blood, but his eyes remained the same, that kind of look that saw everything, that calculated everything. He glanced around quickly, checking the windows, the exits, and then finally fixed his eyes on her. Are you alone? She nodded, unable to find the words. Is Marcus still out there? She nodded again. He exhaled slowly, as if he had just confirmed something he already knew, but hoped was wrong. My name is Cole, he said, his voice softer this time, as if trying not to scare her more than he already had. I'm a federal investigator. I've been working undercover in this city for 6 months. She felt a hysterical laugh rise in her throat, but managed to hold it back. Federal investigator. The words seemed so absurd there, in that small, quiet restaurant, in that forgotten town where nothing important ever happened. You're crazy, she whispered, but her voice came out weak, without conviction. He pulled something from inside his jacket, slowly, keeping his hands visible, and held it out to her. A badge, stained, worn, but real. She took it with trembling fingers, examining every detail in the dim light from the street. It looked legitimate, looked real, but none of it made sense. They use this place to launder money, Cole continued, the words hitting her like stones in the stomach. Your restaurant. 3 other businesses on the same street. Small transactions, hard to trace. Marcus coordinates everything. He thinks you know something. Thinks you saw something. And after you helped me, after you gave me food in front of whoever was watching that night, you became a problem for him. Her legs went weak, and she leaned on the counter. Money laundering. Federal operation. Marcus. It was all too big, too heavy, too real. I didn't see anything, she whispered desperately. I just work here. I know, he interrupted, and there was something like guilt in his voice. I know you didn't do anything, but they don't know that, and they won't wait long to find out. The revelation of what he carried began to take shape in the subtext of what he wasn't saying. Cole hadn't returned because he needed to. He had returned because he chose to. He shouldn't have done it. The mission was clear, objective, cold. Infiltrate, observe, collect evidence, leave. Don't get involved. Don't form bonds. Don't put civilians at greater risk than they already were. But when he had seen her open that door in the early morning, alone, exposed, offering help to a stranger who could be anything, including dangerous, something inside him had cracked. He knew the type. People who still believed in goodness, in a place where goodness was punished. People who extended a hand even when they had everything to lose. And he knew, with the certainty of someone who had seen it happen before, that people like that didn't last long in cities like that. And now she was visible. Because of him. Because he had accepted that plate of food. Because he had stayed there long enough to be seen. Because he had left that damned note, thinking he was helping, when in reality, he had only placed a bigger target on her back. The transformation of a simple gesture into something irreversible was already complete. There was no going back. There was no undoing it. And Cole knew that if he left now, if he left her alone, Marcus wouldn't wait. He would act. And she wouldn't be able to defend herself against something she didn't even fully understand. "You need to leave town," Cole said, but she shook her head immediately. "I can't. This restaurant is all I have. If I leave, I lose everything. If you stay, you lose your life," he replied. His voice harsh but not cruel. It was the voice of someone who had seen what happened to people who stayed. "I can't officially remove you. Not yet. The operation is on a knife's edge. If I expose you now, if I ask for formal protection, they'll know there's someone infiltrated. And 6 months of work will go to waste. An entire corruption network will remain untouched." He ran a hand over his face, tired and conflicted. "But if I do nothing, you'll become a statistic." The conflict tearing him apart inside was now visible in the lines of tension around his eyes, in the way his shoulders seemed to carry a weight too heavy for one body alone. He had sworn to uphold the law. He had dedicated years of his life to it, sacrificed relationships, security, identity. But here, in front of him, was a real person, with real fear, whose only fault had been believing that there was still room for humanity in the world. And for the first time in a long time, Cole couldn't choose between right and just because right was to continue the mission, but just was to protect her, even if it cost everything. He comments, "This story could be real. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject." She looked at Cole for a long moment, processing everything he had just said. The part of her that wanted to believe everything would be all right if she just kept ignoring the signs was slowly dying, suffocated by the reality he had laid on the table. But there was another part, smaller and more stubborn, that refused to accept that a gesture of kindness could have this price. "So what do I do?" she asked, her voice broken and tired. "Do I just stand here and wait? Pretend everything's fine until the day Marcus decides I know too much?" Cole stepped forward, and she noticed for the first time how exhausted he looked. It wasn't just physical tiredness. It was the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying too many heavy secrets for too long. "You're staying close to me this week," he said, and there was a firmness in those words that left no room for discussion. "I'll show up here as a customer. I'll be visible. I'll make it seem like we have nothing more than a normal customer-restaurant owner relationship, but I'll be watching. If Marcus makes any move, I'll know." She wanted to ask how that would help, how his presence would change anything, but something in the way he spoke, the way he positioned himself between her and the door, as if his body were a shield she hadn't asked for but was offering anyway, made her agree. In the days that followed, Cole kept exactly what he had promised. He showed up at the restaurant every day, always at different times, always staying for hours. He ordered coffee, food. Sometimes he just sat and fiddled with his phone like any other customer. But she noticed the details that no one else saw. The way he always chose the table that gave him a complete view of the restaurant. The way his eyes scanned every person who entered. The way he never, not once, turned his back to the door. And the way, whenever Marcus appeared, Cole positioned himself in a way that blocked the direct line of sight between him and her. The shift in their dynamic happened without words. She didn't trust him completely, not yet, but she didn't have anyone else either. And he seemed to understand that, because he never pressured her, never asked for more than she could give. He was just there, present, solid. And little by little, she began to realize that for the first time in 3 years, since her husband had disappeared and left her alone with debt and fear, she wasn't completely alone. There was someone paying attention, someone who saw when she was scared, someone who cared enough to come back, even when they shouldn't. It was on a Wednesday night that Marcus finally made a direct move. He entered the restaurant around 9 o'clock, when the rush was over and only 2 tables remained occupied, one of them Cole's. Marcus didn't order anything. He just stood near the counter, looking at her with that smile she'd always found charming, but which now seemed to have too many teeth. "You've been closing early," he said, his tone casual, but there was something underneath, something sharp. "Is everything all right? Any problems?" She felt her throat go dry. "Everything's fine. Just tired." Marcus nodded slowly, but his eyes didn't believe it. "It's just that we worry, you know? Small town, everyone knows everyone. And when someone starts acting differently, we notice." Before she could answer, Cole stood up. Not quickly, not aggressively. He simply stood, picked up the bill, and walked to the counter to pay. He stood beside Marcus, so close their shoulders almost touched, and the silence that settled was dense, heavy with something she couldn't name, but which made the air seem heavier. Cole placed the money on the counter, looked at her, and then, finally, turned his face to Marcus. "Good evening," he said, and his voice was polite, neutral, but there was something in his gaze, something cold and calculated, that made Marcus take a half step back. Marcus left without saying anything more, but she saw the way he looked at Cole before walking through the door, that kind of look that registers, that memorizes, that plans. And when the door closed, she released the breath she didn't know she was holding. Cole sat back down, as if nothing had happened, but she saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed on the table, once, twice, 3 times, in a nervous rhythm he was trying to hide. "He knows," she whispered, when she was sure they were alone. Cole didn't deny it. He just looked at her with those tired eyes and nodded. "He suspects, but suspecting isn't knowing. And until he's sure, he won't act. And when he is sure..." Cole was silent for a moment too long. "Then we'll be ready." But she wasn't sure she believed that. She wasn't sure if anyone could be ready for the kind of silent violence she felt brewing in the shadows. The impact of that week had fundamentally changed something within her. She had spent 3 years building walls, protecting herself, isolating herself, convinced that the only way to survive was to not need anyone. But now, with Cole there, with his solid, unwavering presence between her and danger, she realized she might have been wrong. Maybe surviving wasn't about being alone. Maybe it was about choosing who to trust when everything falls apart. This is where the story begins to show what's really at stake. On Friday morning, the city awoke differently. There were police cars parked in front of the gas station, yellow tape cordoning off the area, and a tense murmur spreading through the streets like wildfire. She saw it all from the restaurant window while preparing coffee, her stomach churning with a mixture of relief and fear she couldn't name. Marcus had been arrested. Federal operation, they said. Money laundering. Corruption. Involvement with organized crime. The headlines on the cell phones of people entering the restaurant told pieces of the story, but none of them complete. Nobody knew exactly what had happened. They only knew that the city, that small, forgotten city, had been the stage for something much bigger than anyone imagined. Cole didn't show up at the restaurant that morning, nor at lunchtime. And for the first time since he'd started frequenting the place, she felt his absence like a physical void, as if a part of the structure that held her upright had been removed. She tried to concentrate on her work, but the customers wouldn't stop talking about the prison, about Marcus, about how no one suspected anything, about how normal he seemed. And she just listened, silent, her hands busy trying not to tremble. It wasn't until late afternoon, when the activity had thinned out and the sun was beginning to set, that she saw him, but not as before. Cole was across the street, in uniform for the first time. He was no longer the wounded man on the steps. He was no longer the silent customer who spent hours sitting in the corner of the restaurant. He was a federal agent, surrounded by other agents, speaking with authority, gesturing, clearly coordinating something. She stood behind the counter, just observing, and felt something strange settling in her chest. Pride, perhaps, or recognition. Because that man she had fed on a cold morning, whom she had helped without knowing who he was, had just dismantled an entire operation. Alone, or almost alone. He glanced toward the restaurant once, just once, and their eyes met for a second to brief. She waited for some sign, some nod, something to say that all of this had meant something more than work. But he simply looked away and went back to talking to the other agents. And she understood. It had been work. Just work. She had been part of a mission that was now complete, and he had other things to do, other places to go. His journey didn't include her. It never had. She had just been a civilian in his path, someone who needed protection until the danger passed. And now that the danger had passed, there was no reason for him to stay. She closed the restaurant early that day, not because she was afraid, but because she could no longer pretend everything was all right. She went up to the small back room, sat on the worn sofa, and for the first time in weeks, allowed the weariness to truly overtake her. There was immense relief in knowing Marcus was in jail, that the silent threats were over, that she could live again without constantly looking over her shoulder. But there was also a strange sadness, a sense of loss she couldn't justify, because she hadn't lost anything, not really. Cole had never been hers. He had never promised anything beyond temporary protection, and he had delivered. He had done his job. He had left. That was it. But then, when night had already fallen and she was about to turn off the lights, she heard a knock on the door. Soft, hesitant, nothing like the firm, controlled knocks of the last time. She went down the stairs slowly, her heart racing without permission. And when she looked through the crack in the curtain, she saw Cole, alone, out of uniform, wearing the same worn jacket from the first night. She opened the door without thinking, and he entered quickly, as if he didn't want to be seen. There was something different about him. The tension had lessened, but it hadn't disappeared, and when he looked at her, there was something in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. Something like fear, or vulnerability. "I shouldn't have come," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "The operation's over. Marcus is in jail. You're safe now." "I should have left without looking back." She said nothing, just waited, because she knew there was more. There was always more. Cole ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture she'd never seen him make before. "But I couldn't leave without." He paused, searching for the right words, then gave up. "Without telling you the truth." The revelation came slowly, but with the weight of something that had been kept hidden for too long. Marcus wasn't at the top of the chain, Cole said, and she felt her stomach sink. He was just a pawn, an important one, yes, but he wasn't the one in charge, and the person who was in charge is still free, still here. And now that Marcus is down, that person will want to know who talked, will want to know who helped the operation, and you. He looked at her with an intensity that made the air seem heavier. "You fed me when I was nobody, in front of whoever was watching that night. And now, with Marcus in jail, they're going to start connecting the dots." Her legs felt weak, and she leaned against the wall. "You said I was safe." "You were," he replied, and there was something akin to desperation in his voice. "You were safe as long as I was around. But I have to leave. I'm being transferred. New mission, new city. And when I leave, you'll be alone again. And I don't know if..." He stopped, his jaw clenched. "I don't know if I can do this." The impact of those words hit her like a cold wave, because she finally understood. Cole hadn't come back because it was work. He'd come back because he couldn't not come back. Because something between them, small and fragile and completely inconvenient, had grown in the background of all that fear and protectiveness. And now he was there, torn between duty and something neither of them had planned to feel. She comments, "I saw that truth too." From that moment on, everything begins to change silently. She stared at him for a long moment, trying to process what he had just said. So many questions were building up in her throat, so many things she wanted to scream, but all she could whisper was, "Then why did you come back? If you're leaving anyway, why didn't you just go straight there?" Cole closed his eyes for a second, and when he opened them again, there was a brutal honesty there that she wasn't prepared to see. Because I needed you to know that this wasn't just work. Not for me. And because I needed to give you a choice. A choice. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. What kind of choice? She asked. But deep down, she already knew what he was going to say. Cole took a step forward, closing the distance between them, but still leaving enough space so she wouldn't feel trapped. You can stay here. I'll leave an emergency contact. Someone trustworthy who can help you if something happens. You go back to your life, to your restaurant, and hope that whoever is behind all this doesn't see you as a threat. He paused, and she saw the internal struggle unfolding in his eyes. Or you come with me. The impact of those 3 words was physical, like a punch to the gut. Come with you. She repeated, her voice weak and incredulous. Cole, I barely know you. I don't know anything about you. I don't know where you live. I don't know where you're going. I know, he interrupted, his voice soft but firm. I know, it's crazy. I know you have no reason to trust me beyond what you've already seen. But I also know that if I leave here without giving you that option, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if you're okay. And I can't. I can't carry this kind of weight anymore. She saw then, for the first time, with complete clarity, the conflict that had been destroying him from the inside since the beginning. Cole wasn't just a federal agent doing his job. He was a man who had spent years building walls as high as hers, who had learned not to get involved, not to feel, not to let real people into the war zone. That was his life. But something in her, in that simple gesture of offering food to a stranger, had cracked those walls. And now he was there, exposed, vulnerable, offering something he had probably never offered anyone. The chance to be a part of his life, even if that life was messy, dangerous, and full of impossible decisions. I can't just drop everything, she said, but her voice came out less convinced than she wanted. The restaurant, the house, this city, it's all I have. If I go with you, I lose everything. Cole nodded slowly, as if he had already expected this answer. You lose things, but you stay alive. And maybe, in time, you'll build other things, other roots, in another place. He stopped, unable to finish the sentence, but she understood what he wasn't saying. With him, with the possibility of something neither of them had planned, but which already existed, fragile and stubborn, between them. The transformation that had begun that morning when she opened the door continued to unfold, layer by layer, revealing truths she didn't know she was ready to face. She had spent 3 years convincing herself that she didn't need anyone, that being alone was safer, simpler, less painful. But Cole had appeared and, without asking permission, had shown her that sometimes protection isn't weakness. Sometimes trusting isn't naivete. Sometimes letting someone in, even when it's risky, is the bravest thing you can do. How much time do I have to decide? She asked, and Cole looked at his watch, then at her, and there was genuine sadness in his eyes when he answered, 3 days. I have 3 days before I have to leave. If you decide to stay, I'll respect that. I'll get everything ready to protect you as best I can from a distance. But if you decide to come, he paused, and for the first time, she saw something resembling hope on his face. If you decide to come, we'll find a way. Together, she didn't answer immediately. She couldn't, because the decision he was asking of her was too big, too heavy, and she needed time to understand what was really at stake. It wasn't just about safety. It was about the kind of life she wanted to live. It was about choosing between the comfortable known and the frightening unknown. It was about deciding if she was willing to trust again, to risk again, to believe that maybe, just maybe, kindness wasn't always punished. That maybe, this time, reaching out would have saved not only him, but her as well. Cole turned to leave, but before opening the door, he looked back one last time. I know it's a lot, he said, his voice heavy with something she couldn't name, but which made her heart clench. I know I don't have the right to ask this. But you saved me that night, even without knowing who I was. And now I just want to give you the chance to choose what comes next. Whatever you decide, I will respect it. But I needed you to know that there is another option. That you don't have to face this alone if you don't want to. And then he left, leaving her there in the silence of the empty restaurant, with 3 days to make the most important decision of her life. What seemed simple begins to reveal layers that no one expected. She spent the entire night awake, sitting on the sofa, staring at the ceiling, trying to organize thoughts that refused to make sense. 3 days. 3 days to decide between everything she knew and everything she didn't know. Between relative safety and total risk. Between being alone again or trusting someone who had entered her life by accident and was now offering something she didn't even know she wanted. The logical part of her screamed that it was madness. That she barely knew Cole, that he was a stranger. A federal agent with a life she didn't understand, full of dangers she had never faced. But there was another part, quieter and deeper, that whispered an inconvenient truth. She felt safer with him than she had felt in years. And that was no small thing. The next day, she opened the restaurant as usual, but everything seemed different. The tables were the same, the customers were the same, the routine was the same. But she wasn't. Something fundamental had changed inside her, and she felt it in every small decision she made. Every time she looked out the window, every time she heard the door open, every time she found herself searching for Cole, even knowing he'd said he needed to stay away to avoid raising suspicion. His absence was as present as his presence had been, and that scared her more than she wanted to admit. It was on the second day that she realized she wasn't thinking about the restaurant the same way anymore. She spent the morning looking around, seeing the walls she had painted herself, the tables she had bought, used, and restored, the curtains she had sewn by hand when she didn't have the money to buy new ones. Everything there had a story. Everything there had sweat, tears, sleepless nights. It was the place where she had rebuilt her life after her husband disappeared. It was the place where she had learned to survive alone. But it was also the place where she had been trapped. Trapped in fear. Trapped in loneliness. Trapped in a version of herself that had forgotten how to dream of something bigger. The transformation happening within her wasn't about Cole, not entirely. It was about realizing that the life she had built, however secure it seemed, was small, smaller than she deserved, smaller than she was capable of living. And Cole, unknowingly, unplanned, had shown her this. Not because he had offered romance or promises, but because he had offered choice. The possibility that she didn't have. To accept the bare minimum just because the bare minimum seemed safe. She started doing things she hadn't done in years. He picked up an old notebook and began to write. Not a list of pros and cons, because this wasn't the kind of decision that fit into lists, but memories. Things I had forgotten to remember. The way I used to dream of traveling when I was younger. The way I wanted to see the sea, but never went because I always had an excuse, always had a bill to pay, always had a reason to postpone it. The way I had stopped dreaming altogether for the past 3 years, because dreaming hurt more than accepting. On the third day, she woke up with the decision already made. It hadn't been a moment of sudden clarity. It hadn't been a dramatic revelation. It had been something quieter, deeper, a certainty that had grown slowly, like a plant in dark soil, until it finally had enough strength to break through the surface. She was going with him, not because I was sure it would work out, not because I wasn't afraid, but because for the first time in a long time, she wanted to choose life instead of just surviving it. She spent the day putting things in order. She didn't give details to anyone, only saying that she needed to travel for a while, that she had things to take care of in another city. She left the restaurant in the hands of Donna Celia, who had experience and needed the job. She packed the bare minimum, because Cole had said that the less she took, the better. And when night fell, she was ready, or as ready as someone can be to abandon everything they know and follow someone into the unknown. Cole arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, as they had arranged. He entered through the back door, silent, efficient. But when he looked at her and saw the small suitcase beside the door, something changed in his face. The tension lessened. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and there was something in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. It wasn't exactly relief. It was something bigger. It was hope, mixed with responsibility. As if he were happy but also frightened by the weight of what she was entrusting to him. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. She nodded, because if she said anything, her voice would fail her. He took her suitcase, but before opening the door, he stopped and looked at her with that intensity that had become familiar. "I can't promise it will be easy. I can't promise you won't be afraid. But I can promise you won't face anything alone. Not while I have a choice." And for the first time since it all began, she smiled. A small, tired, but real smile. Because she believed him. Not because he was perfect, but because he had proven, without words, without empty promises, that when he said he would protect her, he would. "Write this down." That moved me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. They exited through the back door, cutting through the alley she rarely used, and walked silently to where Cole had parked the car. It wasn't anything flashy. A dark, ordinary sedan, the kind of vehicle that disappears into traffic. He carefully placed her suitcase in the trunk, as if it were something precious, and then opened the passenger door for her. A simple, old-fashioned gesture, but one that carried more meaning than it should. She got in, fastened her seatbelt, and as he started the engine and began to drive, she looked one last time out the rear window. The restaurant grew smaller and smaller, then the street, then the entire city, until everything she knew became just distant lights fading into the darkness. The first 20 minutes of the drive were silent. Not an uncomfortable silence, but the kind of silence that happens when two people are processing something too big to put into words. Cole drove attentively, checking his mirrors frequently, maintaining a constant speed, and she noticed in the small details that he was still in work mode, still vigilant, still calculating risks. She wanted to ask where they were going, how long it would take, what would happen when they arrived. But she didn't ask, because at that moment, the answers didn't matter as much as the fact that she had chosen to trust. And trusting meant leaving some things open, leaving some questions unanswered, for now. Cole broke the silence first. "There's a safe place about 3 hours from here," he said, keeping his eyes on the road. "An apartment the agency keeps for situations like this. Temporary, but safe. We'll stay there for a few days while I finish organizing things." She nodded, absorbing the information. And then, he hesitated, and she saw his jaw clench slightly. "Then I have to go back. Not to your city, but to close the investigation. Marcus was just a piece of the puzzle, and there are other people involved who still need to be identified. It will take maybe 2 or 3 weeks." She felt her stomach clench, but said nothing. 2 or 3 weeks. She would be alone again, in a place she didn't know, waiting for someone who might not return. As if reading her thoughts, Cole continued, his voice softer. "You won't be alone. You have an agent, her name is Sarah, who will keep an eye on you. Not intrusive, she won't be glued to you, but she'll be nearby. And you'll have an emergency number. Anything at all. You call and someone will arrive in less than 10 minutes. He glanced at her quickly, before returning his attention to the road. "I know. It's not ideal. I know you're giving up everything because of a promise I made. But I'll be back. I can guarantee that." The journey they began together was still new, fragile, full of uncertainties. But something was building behind the scenes, something neither of them was ready to name, but which they both felt. It wasn't love, not yet, because love needed time, knowledge, all the little things that build intimacy. But it was the foundation of something that could become love. It was respect. It was trust earned under pressure. It was the awareness that they had seen each other in vulnerable moments, and neither of them had looked away. When they stopped to refuel, she got out of the car to stretch her legs while Cole filled the tank. The night was cold. The air had that smell of the road, of possibility, of distance. She looked at the sky and saw more stars than she saw in the city, and for a moment, she allowed the reality of what she had done to fully hit her. She had left everything behind. He had bet everything on someone he had known for less than 2 weeks. And the scariest part was that she didn't regret it. Not completely. Because for the first time in 3 years, she felt she was moving towards something, instead of just running away from everything. When they got back to the car, Cole bought coffee for the two of them, and offered her some with a tired half-smile. "It's going to be a long night," he said, and she took the cup, feeling the warmth in her hands. "I know." They stayed there for a few more minutes, leaning against the car, drinking cheap gas station coffee, and she realized that this was the kind of moment normal people had in normal situations. Simple, ordinary, and somehow, in the midst of all the madness, it made her feel more connected to him than any grand declaration could have. When they finally arrived at the apartment, it was past midnight. It was an anonymous building in a neighborhood that seemed to have been built solely for people who needed to disappear for a while. Cole went up first, checked everything, and only then gestured for her to come in. The apartment was small, clean, functional. Nothing personal. Nothing to indicate that anyone actually lived there. But it had a bed, a sofa, a basic kitchen, and it had locks on the door. Lots of locks. "I'll stay tonight," Cole said, putting her suitcase in the room. "Sarah shows up tomorrow morning, and I have to go. But for today, you won't be alone." She nodded, too grateful to form words. And when he sat on the sofa, clearly planning to spend the night there awake, she didn't argue. She just grabbed a blanket from the closet and threw it to him. "At least try to get some rest," she said, and he smiled, a small, genuine smile. "You too." But neither of them slept well that night. She, because she was processing, he, because he was protecting. And in the silence of that strange apartment, the truth that neither of them had said aloud began to take shape. They had become important to each other, not by planning, but by necessity. And necessity, sometimes, was the strongest glue there was. This is where the story begins to show what's really at stake. Cole left the next morning, as promised. Sarah showed up shortly after, a woman in her early 30s, short hair, an attentive but not threatening gaze. She introduced herself quickly, left a phone number, explained the basics about safety, and then gave her space. She didn't cling. She didn't ask intrusive questions. She simply existed on the periphery, a silent presence that should have brought comfort but somehow only reinforced how strange the situation was. She was living in a temporary bubble of safety, suspended between what she had left behind and what she didn't yet know was to come. The first few weeks were the hardest. Not because anything physical was lacking, but because there were so many empty hours. She had spent 3 years filling every minute with work, with chores, with anything that would prevent the silence from becoming too loud. But now, in that small, anonymous apartment, silence was all she had. And in the empty spaces, thoughts grew. She found herself going over every decision, every moment since that early morning when she opened the door to a wounded stranger. Had she made the right choice? Would Cole really come back? And the question that haunted her most, the one she tried to push down but that always resurfaced, had she mattered to him, or had she just been another civilian who needed protection? Cole would call when he could, but the calls were short, controlled. He never gave details about what he was doing, where he was, or who he was talking to. He would only ask if she was okay, if she needed anything, if Sarah had shown up. And then, before she could ask anything deeper, he would hang up, always with the same phrase, "I'll be right back." But right back was elastic, imprecise. Right back could be days. It could be weeks. And she would stay there, alone with the uncertainty, trying to build a temporary life while waiting for something she didn't know if it really existed. It was in the 3rd week that something changed. Cole called, but this time, his voice was different, more tense, more urgent. "I need you to listen carefully," he said, and she felt her stomach clench immediately. The investigation revealed something I didn't expect. There's someone above Marcus. Someone we hadn't identified before. And this person knows about you. The world seemed to stop for a second. How do you know about me? Cole hesitated, and she heard voices in the background. Other people talking, movement. Marcus spoke. Not officially, but he let slip information during an interrogation. He mentioned he had a potential witness, a woman who had helped someone suspicious. And now this person at the top wants to know who you are, wants to know what you saw, what you know. The revelation hit her like ice water. She was no longer just someone who had helped a stranger. She was a piece on a chessboard she couldn't fully see. And worse, she was a piece someone powerful wanted to remove. "What do I do?" she asked, and the voice came out firmer than she expected. "You stay exactly where you are," Cole replied immediately. "Sarah will reinforce security. Nobody knows where you are. Nobody will know. But I need you to understand the gravity of this. The person we're looking for isn't like Marcus. Marcus was an enforcer. This person is the one who gives the orders. And they don't leave loose ends." The impact of those words was physical. She sat on the sofa, her legs weak, trying to process what he was saying. She had thought the worst was over. That with Marcus imprisoned, the danger was gone. But now she realized she had been naive. The danger had never ended. It had only changed form. "Cole," she said, her voice low, heavy with fear she could no longer hide. "I don't know anything. I didn't see anything. I only gave you food. How did that make me a target?" There was silence on the other end, and when he finally answered, there was something in his voice she had never heard before. Something like anger, but also guilt. "Because you saved me when no one else would have. And now they think you know who I am. They think you're part of this. And as long as they think that, you're in danger." The hidden truth that had been brewing in the background was finally being fully revealed. Wasn't a victim of circumstance. She was the deliberate target of someone she had never seen, never met, but who now knew her name, knew she existed, and wanted to make sure she could never speak about something she didn't even know she had witnessed. The transformation of a gesture of kindness into something irreversible was complete. And now, the journey she had begun alongside Cole was no longer about choosing a new life. It was about surviving long enough to see if that new life was even possible. "I'll solve this," Cole said, and there was a determination in his voice that was almost frightening. "I'll find out who this person is. I'll close this investigation. And I'll make sure you never have to look over your shoulder again. But in the meantime, you need to trust me. You need to stay where you are. You need to let me do what I know how to do." She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and then replied with the only thing she could say. "I trust you." And it was true. Against all logic, against all fear, she trusted him. Because he had proven, time and again, that when he said he would protect, he would. Even when it cost him dearly. Even when it was easier to leave. She hung up the phone and sat there for a long time, staring at the blank screen, feeling the weight of everything that had been said and everything that had yet to be revealed. There was fear, yes, but there was also something stronger, growing beneath. A determination she didn't know she possessed. Because if anyone thought she would crumble just because the danger had returned, that person didn't know what she had already survived. She had lost a husband to secrets. She had rebuilt a life from scratch. She had learned to lock doors and still choose to open them when it mattered. And now, even scared, even alone in that apartment that wasn't hers, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't going to let kindness turn into regret. Cole had returned to her, not because he needed to, but because he chose to. And now she was going to make the same choice. She was going to stay. She was going to trust him. I was going to wait as long as necessary, because some stories don't resolve quickly. Some stories require patience, courage, and the will to believe that in the end, protection is not weakness. It's the strongest form of love that exists. 3 weeks turned into 4, then 5. And somewhere in between, She stopped counting the days and started living them. Sarah became a strangely comforting presence. The apartment ceased to be a prison and began to feel like a temporary refuge. And Cole's calls, even short, even controlled, were enough to remind her that she wasn't forgotten. That someone, somewhere, was working to ensure she could have a future without fear. And then, on a rainy Thursday, the door slammed. 3 firm knocks. She looked at Sarah, who was in the kitchen, and saw the immediate tension in the other woman's body. But then Sarah looked through the peephole, relaxed her shoulders, and opened the door. It was Cole, different from what she remembered. Thinner, more tired, but whole. And when his eyes met hers, there was something there that hadn't been before. Something definitive. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse, exhausted, but true. "The person at the top has been identified. Arrested this morning. The whole network has collapsed. And you." He took a step toward her, closing the distance that had existed for weeks. "You don't need to hide anymore." She felt the tears welling up before she could stop them. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of exhaustion, of everything she had held on to for so long finally being released. "And now?" she asked, because she needed to hear from him what came next. Cole smiled, a tired but genuine smile. "Now you choose. Again, do you want to go back to your city? I guarantee it's safe. Or," he hesitated, and for the first time since she'd known him, he seemed genuinely nervous. "Or you stay with me. Not out of fear, not for protection, but because we started something here that neither of us planned. But that might be worth exploring where it leads." And she knew, in that moment, what the answer was. Because kindness had changed everything. It had saved him. It had saved her. And now, finally, they had the chance to discover what happened when protection transformed into something more. Something that didn't yet have a name, but that already existed, solid and true, between the two of them. If stories about choice, protection, and feelings resonate with you, subscribing to Heart of Protection Stories is your way to continue this journey with me. Comment below. I'm with you until the end. If any part of this story touched you, leave a like so I know you made it this far. And there's a video over here that continues in the same vein of stories that stay with you. Click and follow along there.